Can you red pill Bill Gates? Does Bill Gates just not know about 1350? Does Bill Gates just doesn't have the evidence about, Putnam's diversity research? Has he just not seen the crime stats? Is he unaware of what's going on? We just need to educate Bill Gates. He just doesn't have enough facts and figures. The truth has been hidden from him. He needs to watch The Greatest Story Never Told. He needs to be red-pilled. He needs to learn all these things, and then he'll spring into action. He'll say, what have I been doing? I was a naive man. I bought into all this propaganda, this liberal propaganda. Now I've seen the light, and I'm going to use my billions to benefit the white race. Is that what's going to happen? I think QAnon is smarter than that. I think if you believe that explicitly or implicitly, as a lot of these people do, who say we just need 1 billionaire, I think QAnon is smarter than that. QAnon's obviously dumb for a number of reasons, but QAnon at least understands in some sense that, Bill Gates isn't a dumb guy, and that he's capable of duplicity. He's capable of believing one thing and saying a different thing. So, Bill Gates is just an archetype, right? I don't really care in particular about Bill Gates, but I'm just talking about the archetype of the white billionaire who racialists believe should, by the force of white racial solidarity, be compelled to defend his race because it's in his ethnic genetic interest to do so. But he's not, and they don't have an explanation for this. And every time I ask them why, they continue to just, plead the fifth and say, we don't know why. You should tell us. Well, I'm telling you. It's because this mystical force of racial solidarity doesn't exist. It's not real. It's a phantasm. It's an internet subculture. And before that, it was a Nazi subculture. It was after World War II. There was this pre-internet period where it was essentially a religious cult. In the same way that the Muslims have a concept of the Ummah and the Christians have a concept of the body of Christ, this became racialized as the white race. We're all white brothers, and we need to get together to fight the race war. This is, in a sense, the totalization of the biological concept of the nation, where you're expanding it on a pan-European continental scale. And so we can understand the origins of this religious cult, but we also have to critically examine it as unreality. It is not the case that there's going to be a spontaneous great awakening or red pilling where, due to competition from other groups, white people spontaneously snap into this again great awakening where they all just sort of cohere together as a political entity. And the primary reason why is because the people who I think are the most aware of intergroup conflict are the ones who are sort of most in favor of it. You hear a lot about CRT these days, and CRT is all about racial differences. CRT is all about dropout rates and crime rates, and Kamala Harris said recently something about number of trees per race, which, look, people laugh at her. But that's a legitimate thing. I think there's nothing to laugh at there. The idea that different demographics are having different levels of trees. I mean, I like having trees, so I think it is an important thing to look at. But Kamala's aware, and Biden's aware, and Gates is aware. I mean, everybody's aware of these differences. And the ones who are the most aware of it are the most interested in increasing diversity and increasing immigration. And, with the exception, I guess, Kamala Harris is not white, but, Biden and Gates and Koch and Musk and Bezos, when Bezos looks at his company and he says, if I make it more diverse, it will be less unionized, it's in their interest to promote diversity. And you wishing that was not the case is not going to change that. So I'm interested in sort of dealing with the reality of the situation, which is that racialism and white racial solidarity is a form of delusional, wishful thinking, that the solution to a fractured, confused, post-Christian world is this total scientific, biological reductionism to invert the current paradigm that they call anti-white, which I think is a silly term because, the people who promote, and again, you're just going to say Jews, right? This is the sword to cut the Gordian knot is, well, it's all just Judaism and they've been brainwashed and Bill Gates is a Shabbos goy. That type of thing, I mean, even to the point where they'll say Christianity is a conspiracy to control the Aryan race. That kind of thinking is infantilizing. It's taking someone like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and the Koch brothers and Bezos, and it's saying that these people are like infants who can't think for themselves and they're easily controlled and outmaneuvered. And I just don't believe that. I just don't buy that theory. I also don't buy it because, the military, as, much as it is directed toward the defense of Israel, is still not staffed by the generals, by Jewish generals or something like that. So I just don't think that sort of one-sided Jews control everything narrative is tenable. I think the Freemasonic perspective is much simpler in the sense, I mean, I guess you could say, oh, Jews control everything. That's a very simple narrative. But in terms of explaining, like, how is it that all these Jews control all of these white billionaires completely without any cracks in their control? How is that possible? I think it's simpler to say that these people are acting of their own will. It's like when you see somebody, attack somebody else, do you say, oh, he's just being mind controlled by the Jews, or do you say, he's working of his own agency? If someone's coming at you with a knife, say, brother, I understand you're not actually attacking me. The Jews are mind controlling you. Or do you just say, this guy's attacking me? The incentives for white billionaires is clear, and it doesn't point toward white racial solidarity. The era of nationalism, where you have an elite which presents itself as the head in an organic body, is over because the economic conditions that incentivize the education of the populace have changed significantly. It doesn't mean that there's a black and white, one day you have a Prussian schooling system where, you're trying to educate all the people and mobilize them toward a mass nationalist society, and then the next day everyone is being children are being put on drugs, and fertility rates drop to zero, and 99% of the world's population is slated for extinction. It's not a black and white process. And so there's all these intermediate forms between these two systems that creates confusion, that creates a sense of people not really understanding what's going on and not being able to discern what's happening. And so we can say, well, there are these transitional forms, and we can mistake these as accidents or deviations, when really what we're kind of seeing is an object in a state of motion. And what we need to understand when we ask ourselves, like, what has changed between 1950 or 1850 or whatever day you want to, whatever year you want to say, this was when everything was normal and natural. And you say, well, what's changed? We're sort of looking at the motion of an object through space over time. That's how I conceive of it. We can create vectors, we can create quantitative and qualitative measures of what's going on. And rather than viewing these motions as arbitrary or the result of entropy, as Spangler said, we're just watching the degeneration of a civilization. We're watching the death of a civilization. It's just a natural organic process. Instead, looking at asking this question of if there was an active force, not just a passive force of entropy, but an active intentional will behind what was going on, what would that force look like? So, in the case of this economic transition, what the force looks like is there are a small number of people with power, and they look at the populace and they say, we used to need these people. World War II, mass mobilization, every man, woman, and child counts. Everyone's mobilized. People are building tanks and bombs and guns. And from the perspective of a social administrator, every single human being in the territory that you administrate is valuable, because anyone can work in a factory. And factory workers are valuable. They provide value. Even if it's a small value, it's a positive value, because you can use those people to make weapons, and you can use those weapons to win wars. But after World War II, something starts to change. With von Neumann and cellular automata, you get the development of computers, theoretical models for Turing machines. Konrad Zuse came up with a computer in a basement in Germany during World War II, and those models for that hardware was then taken and applied, and eventually you get this concept of automation, which goes back very far historically in terms of magical or alchemical concepts of automation, but it becomes actualized, and we start to have in the 1970s the introduction of computing and computation and calculation on a mass scale in terms of economic production. And you start to see a shift away from we have to mobilize all the elements of our population to we don't need these people anymore. And there's a lot of experiments that happen as you're starting to see the gears turning, to make a pun here. We're starting to see the gear shift in society and the projections and the futurology of, are we going to need all these millions of people in a mass society, or are we going through a new transition, the same as we went through from agriculture to an industrial society, where the focus isn't, okay, everyone's a fundamentalist Christian, have 8 kids per woman. Now, industrial economy, we're introducing first wave feminism. Okay, women can be factory workers too. Now we're going into another turn, another shift in social mores. And you get the Vietnam War, and you get the 1960s and the sexual revolution. Why? Because there's a realization that if you're a societal administrator, you don't need these people. Because we're moving beyond a stage of economic production where every single person is valuable, or like 99% of people can work a factory job. But what if you have automation and robots where you don't need that anymore? There's still useful people. There's programmers and engineers and society and middle management bureaucrats and whatnot. But you don't need manual laborers anymore. You know, if someone has an IQ below 90, what are they doing at this point? They are mostly acting as service workers. Service meaning it is a convenience. It's not fundamentally economically necessary activity, but it's the way in which a majority of people find themselves servicing the convenience of the actual productive minority. Ultimately, the question of where is value determined from, I would say, is from the military, right? And in the feudal world, the military was a product of how much grain could you skim off your peasantry to feed your mercenaries or your knights so that you could go to war. Grain, foodstuffs was the basic real currency, the real capital that you used in the pyramid scheme to fuel the priests and the knights and build your castles and everything else. In Egypt, it was building the pyramids, right? So that economic mode of production didn't change for a long time until industrial society, where all of a sudden you didn't need just tons of peasants. You didn't need people having 8 kids. You needed people who were capable of doing factory work. Factory work is something that 99% of people are capable of doing, but it does require mobilization, education, coordination. And an ideology like nationalism makes sense in that context, which is why China is still in that ideological mode, because it's still in that economic mode of production. But ultimately, I think in the West, the elites saw the future. And it wasn't hard. You just had to listen to the experts who were saying, look, computation is on the horizon. We're going to have the ability to construct machines which are capable of following programs. And we can develop those. And this technology took on relatively quickly from the point at which we started the field of computer science to the point where we're actually implementing that. It's actually fairly quick. And, you know, computers are already quite developed before the internet as we know it. The internet was first developed as a military technology and then was released to the public in the 90s and has just taken off in the last few decades, has really taken off. And the economic shift is what has produced the social shift. That you say, well, we don't really need gender roles anymore because we don't need people having families and kids. And that was the origin point of the concept of gender roles as such. So we don't need those things anymore. You know, we don't need whiteness anymore because, you know, that was invented as under a mode of production where you're having nationalism and you're having colonialism. Well, we're not utilizing those techniques anymore. Right now we have an international stock market where I don't need to occupy Vietnam with troops and guns all I needed to do is buy some stock in a Vietnamese corporation or something like that. So everything has been digitized, financialized, globalized to the point where economic parasitism no longer needs an expeditionary force on the ground where you're going to enforce a concept of whiteness to otherize the native populations so that you can better control them. You don't really need that anymore. And in fact, what's going on is an internal colonization where the populations to be subjected are not third world populations, they're the first world populations. The danger here, or the threat, or the most stochastic or chaotic element to be controlled are these populations which used to have a great standard of living back in the 60s and 70s, but because of the shift in economic production are now basically having the rug swept out from under them, right? You have a class of, white people in the West who used to be able to support a family on a single income now struggle to do it with two people and with far less children than before, to the point where people feel like they can't afford to have children, let alone they can't even afford to live as bachelors. You just look at the prices of, it used to be within a man's means, he would be 20 years old, has a factory job, he can buy a house, he can buy a car, wife can stay home, he can have kids. This was the peak of industrial production in the 1960s, where the system had been so refined and so perfected to the point that it could support that standard of living. But because the mode of production has changed and all those people have become obsolete and worthless, to the point where their only function in the economy is these service jobs where they're not actually producing anything, they're just fluffing the smaller and shrinking productive class of programmers and engineers, automators, and the bureaucrats who manage these populations, right? People say, well, the ones who are really important are the truck drivers. And yeah, there's cargo that truck drivers drive that is important, foodstuffs and whatnot. But think of all the products on Amazon that are bought and sold, which are really products of convenience. These are not, you're not buying and selling houses on Amazon. You're not buying and selling land. You're not buying and selling cars. You're not buying and selling wives and children, hopefully not. You are buying and selling toys, and you're buying and selling decorations, and you're buying and selling. So there's a huge mass quantity of cheap Chinese plastic goods which are produced overseas by cheap labor and then brought here and moved around by truckers. And so there's a huge percentage of the wage of the blue-collar man which is coming from the proceeds of profits that are dedicated toward the production of frivolities and, decorations, essentially. Status symbols, not actual productive items like foodstuffs or weaponry or housing or something, agricultural tools, military technology. And so these people are not needed. And every social trend that you see has to be viewed from that lens of, you've got an elite that doesn't want you around unless you're super productive. And if you are, you will be awarded a wage that is basically equivalent to what your grandparents had. So, if you're an engineer or computer programmer, you can make the six-figure salary that allows you to support the family on a single income and allows you to have that status and allows you to have the gated community away from crime and allows you to have your gated community that's going to be secluded and with the good schools and everything. So you don't feel the effects and you don't feel the changes. But everybody else is subjected to that because they're not needed, because they're not wanted. How do you change those incentives? You don't red pill the elite because they're aware of all the facts and figures. What you do is you introduce a new technology that creates a new economic mode of production, or you have a religious movement that through a priest class is able to regulate the elite basically through a top-down, theocratic, disciplinary moralism, that you have an aggressive moralization where there is a church hierarchy which is independent from the economic mode of production, which mobilizes the population to put a check upon this free disillusion of the populace. I think relying upon one or the other is a little bit difficult because, what kind of technology could you produce that would fundamentally change the situation? I would say it would be some kind of mass gene editing where we'd get to the point where people simply aren't being born who are not capable of fulfilling real productive needs in the economy, which is difficult to conceive of at this point, although it is possible. And then the other choice you have is, religion, which simply suppresses the incentive structure with its own incentive structure. But that's always tough. That's always tough to have the two working against one another. What I find generally is that the priest class is going to try to accommodate itself and try to work out a deal with the elites. So there's a question here of the acceleration of these processes. How quickly will they play out? And so that's the conservative position is we need to slow down these processes as much as possible to prevent as much damage as possible. I think that's kind of drawing out the process. I'm not really super interested in doing that myself. I'm basically in agreement with the elites here. I think that the mode of production we have has made most people obsolete, and there's really no way to get around it. You can paper over it, you can lie about it, you can say, we're going to go back to the good times, but this is what we're dealing with. And you can be dishonest about it, you can be honest about it. I mean, I'd like to be honest about it. I like to just say, this is what we're dealing with. And as individuals, we need to turn toward groups, and I would say religious groups, where we are going to find meaning and purpose in an economy that doesn't value us. Because that's sort of a unique situation to be in for 99% of humans throughout history. You think in a tribal group, every man is useful. You look at the Native Americans in their conflicts with the Europeans, and there were certain Indian wars where 90% of the men are being mobilized. Teenagers up to 50-year-olds are given bows and arrows, and you're the warrior class, go out and fight. There are very few men who are jobless in such a society. Every man has a purpose, and of course in a feudal farming economy, same thing. Everybody's a farmer, everyone has a purpose. In an industrial economy, everyone's a factory worker, everyone has a purpose. And this has just been the natural state of man as animal, as citizen, as a worker for ever, for our entire evolutionary history. The only way that you don't fit into this paradigm is if you're extremely sick or disabled, and that's a sad way to be. But what we're at now is the pyramid's inverted, whereas before 99% of people have a purpose, they have a use, they have economic utility, and there's a social structure and a religious structure that supports and values and dignifies that labor. Now it's the opposite. Now 99% of people are really quite useless, because most of what people do all day is they solve problems revolving around convenience and frivolity and decoration and things that are not crucial to real economic utility. That, think of it in these terms of, you have a population of millions of people, and a very small percentage of them are actually working on weapons technology, drone technology, programming problems. You get to the point where it's like 1% of people are actually working on real problems that help advance the interests of the state or the military or, the tech sector. And then 99% of other people are, busing people around, transporting people from point A to point B. They're serving frappuccinos at Starbucks. They're in the fire economy, finance, insurance, real estate, entertainment. They're basically there to do something a computer could do, except to do it with a smile, because as we've shifted economic production, we've destroyed a lot of the social fabric. And so we have an entire class of people who are dedicated toward being a fake friend. That's what sales is, right? When you say sales, what you mean is we're going to try to create artificial demand for products that people don't need, and we're going to do so by pretending to be people's friend. And that is, it's kind of sick, and I don't think it's sustainable. I think all of that's going to collapse. So people need to come to terms with this in their own way, but I don't think digging into the colonial identity of whiteness is wise. I don't think it makes sense on a biological level. I think we know who's going to biologically survive and thrive in the next century. And, if you're going to say, oh, well, look at Africa, the population is quadrupling. It's like, sure, the population is quadrupling, but if it can go up, it can go down. If it can go up, it can fall just as quickly. If you look at African Americans, they have a negative fertility rate. The only reason why the black populace is not dropping is because of immigration from Africa, from the Caribbean. So heritage African Americans who are descendants of slaves, are in decline and have been in decline for several decades and will be in decline indefinitely into the future. And so there's no reason why Africans in Africa couldn't develop the same level of cultural malaise that Africans in America have, to the point where they have negative fertility. I expect to see a lot of these trends worsen beyond anyone's wildest imagination. And so, I don't think the big demographic winner of the 21st century is going to be Africans, even though people have been sort of predicting that forever. I think the big winners are going to be the people who are able to insulate themselves from these processes. And those are going to be people with wealth and power. So, if you're interested in your genetic interests and your progeny, the best thing that you could do would probably be to make as much money as possible. And you're not going to do that by, advocating for whiteness. Most white people are not going to make it through this process. The end result is probably going to be genetic engineering that's going to change the human species possibly beyond recognition. We don't know what form that would take. But it will be dramatic, and people who don't have access to that or who aren't willing to participate in that will be subject to the same kind of negative structures that we're currently seeing, just on an amplified scale. So these are things which are real. I mean, you can sort of hand wave and say like, oh, you think, someone said, oh, you think technology is going to solve everything? It's not a question of problematizing or solving problems. It's a question of processes and incentives. Technology is a huge incentive, right? Technology is hugely impactful, and it should be taken into consideration when we try to calculate the future. So I'm not saying, oh, technology is going to solve everything. I'm saying technology is important, and we should take stock of it when we try to understand what's going to happen in the next 100 years. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Follow my Twitter at Jokull, Jokkull. Like the video, comment on the video, thumbs it up, thumbs it down, share it on Twitter, video chat me on Telegram. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Nice.
Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful.
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.